Hey, what is up guys, and welcome to an in-depth review on Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, From Software's latest spiritual successor to the Dark Souls series, which really should be called Sekiro: Shadows Die 1,000 times, because in this game you will die a lot. And while in other games that can bog down the experience, especially if the gameplay or fun factor isn't quite there, Sekiro is downright addicting, and its challenge is almost always a joy to overcome. So, to find out what makes this grueling trial of a game such a worthy spiritual sequel to its predecessors, let's start by jumping into the visuals. Sekiro is made up of an intriguingly gritty art style that's very unique to most games out there, but fits perfectly within the game world of Shadows Die Twice and its extremely unforgiving nature. Now, in the past, I've also enjoyed the visuals of previous From Software games. However, there was always something about them that made the graphics and textures look just a little bit too dark and muddy in my opinion. But Sekiro does a nice job at cleaning everything up so that the entire presentation stands out more effectively. The new anti-aliasing method they used here, for example, is far better than what we've seen in their previous games, giving Sekiro a much crisper aesthetic overall. And this improved visual direction does a great job at allowing enemies to really pop against their surroundings and the environments they occupy. Speaking of enemies, Sekiro features some of the absolute best character and monster design on the market. And what's crazy is that not only does the game feature an absurd amount of different types of enemies, but it actually excels in all areas of their design, no matter what their style. Whether that be the most creatively hideous of enemies, with unsettling body parts like a giant centipede for a head, or the most ominously beautiful of them that give off the feeling of being larger than life. The game does an exceptional job at providing them with riveting appearances and lifelike animations. Similarly, many of the different environments are also quite captivating, and just like the different enemies, the many locations are adequately varied as well, with unique areas ranging anywhere from treacherous toxic canyons to mysterious divine realms. If you've played previous From Software games, you might notice a similar pattern of locations, with Sekiro featuring explorable areas like castle rooftops and your typical dungeons. But with this game being set in feudal Japan, and with it featuring a slightly new art style to match the setting, those familiar locations still actually manage to feel quite fresh. All in all, Sekiro is an especially gorgeous game, full of impressive world spaces likely to take your breath away, and creepy character designs capable of keeping you up at night. But good visuals are only part of what make up a game like this. So with them out of the way, let's move on to the gameplay. And we'll go ahead and start with the big question. Is Sekiro harder than Dark Souls? And the answer to that question is, it just isn't that simple. If we're only talking personally, then yes, I'd have to say I had an easier time with this than I did when I played Dark Souls. But what's interesting is that many of the hardcore fans of the series I've heard from actually find Sekiro to be the most difficult one they've played. And I think that discrepancy all boils down to just how much Sekiro mixes it up in the gameplay department. This go around, the combat is all about getting through your opponent's guard, by utilizing different attacks, gadgets, and well-timed deflections that help break an enemy's posture, so that you can deal a death blow. It can be difficult to get used to or come to grips with these new mechanics, especially for older fans. But I actually found myself enjoying the combat as a result of these new implementations far more than I did back in Dark Souls. Via several shinobi tools that you can find through exploration and beating bosses, you can do all sorts of new tricks to help you deal with the different enemies, like stunning them with firecrackers, or breaking down their shields with a spring-loaded axe. Like Dark Souls, Sekiro has one of the few combat systems out there that feels like it has some real weight to it. When you hit an enemy or vice versa, there's a real sense of impact that you get as a result. And that aspect in particular, paired with the various new mechanics and the sheer variety of unique bosses, is what allows for this to be such a meaningful and enjoyable combat system. In my opinion, it offers the perfect challenge. And it's what makes for those moments where you feel like pumping your fist in the air after beating a difficult boss. And for those moments where you maybe refrain from breaking your controller after the 50th attempt at facing a boss, just so you can give it one more try. When it comes to traversing the world of Sekiro, rather than simply walking everywhere, you now have the option to use a grappling hook to get from place to place. This was one of the coolest new additions if you ask me, as it opened up for a ton of fun new possibilities involving the level design in both the open world areas and the game's larger boss fights. Believe me, there's nothing like flying through the air at breakneck speeds with a giant snake on your ass. On top of the increased focus on verticality, Sekiro also has a much greater emphasis on stealth than that of the Dark Souls series, most likely thanks to the change in setting. It plays a particularly big role when facing large groups of enemies, as well as when taking on many of the game's bosses that require more than one death blow to finish off. Of course, you still have the option to do things the old-fashioned way, it just makes things a little more difficult. All things considered, some really cool new systems here, but despite all of the praise, Sekiro does unfortunately have some issues when it comes to its gameplay. While very few in number, the problems it does have are some that have been with the series ever since the beginning. Many of the game's bosses, for instance, will occasionally turn on a dime mid-attack in order to get a cheap hit on you. And with some seemingly unnatural hitboxes at times, it can lead to more than your desired share of those moments where you just have to stop and question how on earth the guy hit you. And sadly, I think this has to do with the fact that the game sometimes favors a specific button input over your position. The other big issue has to do with Sekiro's controls. The main problem I found here is that a few of the game's special moves are bound to the same buttons as things like your dodge. This can end up resulting in a few scenarios where, if you were pressing the left thumbstick just a second before, your character will attempt to step out of the way, rather than performing something like the desired Makiri counter move, leading to an almost always punishing outcome. Luckily, you can change the controller setup here, so if you find that you're having problems, that option might be worth a look. Overall, despite a few annoying issues, Sekiro's gameplay is extremely addicting, and features some of the best combat you'll find in gaming. At its core, it's an unforgiving challenge, but for that very same reason, most people who play it will also find it to be deeply rewarding. And with that said, let's move on to sound.
My name is Kyobu Masataka Oniwa! As I breathe, you will not pass the castle gate!
And let's go ahead and kick things off with the music. There are a lot of tracks here, which I love. It's always disappointing when you're playing a game and enjoying it, only to suddenly realize you've been hearing the same 3 tracks the entire time. At which point it's almost better to turn the damn music off, rather than risk going insane. But Sekiro doesn't have that problem in the slightest. It features a vast array of different toned melodies that work well for pretty much every obstacle the game throws at you. Wander into a creepy cave that you probably shouldn't be in and the game will have an eerie track to match. Decide you want to take on an enemy 5 times your size with a sword that could cut 3 of you in half, and the game has an equally intense song for that too. That's not to say you won't ever hear the same track twice, but because the game has so many, and also just because of how damn good all the tracks sound, the few times that you do recognize a tune, it's often more of an occurrence that you end up embracing, rather than shying away from. Voices are also really well done here, and that actually goes for both the original Japanese dialogue, as well as the English voiceovers. I had a chance to listen to each a good amount, and while the native language fits the setting a bit better, the English voiceover definitely didn't disappoint.
Another rat. But those eyes, a starving wolf. Before I kill you, tell me your name. Tell me your name! No name to give. You shinobi are all the same. You die nameless, with no one to mourn you. However, your left arm, a prosthetic shinobi arm, it reminds me of... That's it. A one-armed wolf. I like it. Which means Sekiro. That is what I shall name you. Who are you? I am the Tengu of Ashina. Come, Sekiro. Care to hunt some rats with me?
The main character is voiced by the same guy who played Charles in Red Dead Redemption 2, and he, as well as the rest of the cast, do a great job at setting the overall tone of mostly despair with slight bits of hope sprinkled throughout. Additionally, the sounds of combat, while not the most realistic, are oddly satisfying to listen to, especially when you end up dealing a death blow and get to watch as spurts of blood come shooting out of vital enemy organs. Plus, the different sounds enemies make, just like the visual cues, do a decent job at distinguishing different attacks, and cluing you into when and if you should block, dodge, or even jump out of the way, which is not only a great help and addition due to how difficult the game is, but it also gives the various enemies you fight a bit more character. It makes them feel like they're more than just sacks of meat waiting to be cut to shreds by the player. By and large, some exceptional sound design across the board, that without a doubt helps elevate this experience to a whole new level. And now with the sound covered, and without mentioning any spoilers, let's move on to the story. In Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, you'll play through the compelling story of the One-Armed Wolf, a shinobi who has to fight his way through feudal Japan in order to rescue his kidnapped master Lord Kuro, and rid the land of a powerful curse stemming from dragon's blood. Amidst your journeys, you'll trek through countless memorable locations and battle your way through dozens of interesting and challenging boss fights, including one of my favorites of all time, involving a group of mysterious monkeys that you have to track down in order to trap in a set of paintings, with each of the monkeys offering a different quirk that you have to overcome to catch them off guard, such as spectacular vision capable of spotting you from a mile away, or ears capable of hearing a pin drop. It should be noted though that Sekiro is unlike most games out there in the sense that it does not hold your hand at all when it comes to the story, or really anything else for that matter. You have a ton of freedom regarding how you complete different parts of your journey. In fact, some of the game's most intriguing areas are completely optional. The best way to describe it is like piecing together a puzzle. There are many different ways to go about it, and rarely, if ever, does the game just spell it out for you. Story-wise, Sekiro is also a lot like both Dark Souls and Bloodborne in the sense that a decent amount of the narrative is somewhat subsurface, and found within things like item descriptions and lesser characters sprinkled throughout the world. However, unlike Dark Souls, the majority of Sekiro's story is actually far more front and center this time around, and I felt that it hugely benefited because of it. What they have here is something truly special, and I believe that this is definitely how From Software should continue moving forward. This way you keep all of the hidden lore for players who enjoy exploring and seeking that stuff out, but also end up with a story that's a bit more impactful and easy to follow. In summary, this is one of those can't-miss stories for fans of From Software games. And while the open-ended nature of things may leave you needing to check a guide from time to time, this style of storytelling also makes it all the more rewarding when you are able to figure things out on your own. So finally, with the story covered, it's time we give this game a final rating. Sekiro no doubt has its flaws, and definitely enough of them to keep this from being called a perfect experience. However, I absolutely adored this game from start to finish. I found it to be much faster paced combat-wise than previous From Software games, and I loved all of the creative additions they decided to implement, as well as the new world and its characters. And thus, in my book, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice justly earns itself a 9 out of 10. Let me stress that this one is definitely not for everyone, especially the faint of heart. But for those who are willing to push through it and take on the challenge, I can assure you, you won't be let down. In fact, I'd go as far as to say this is easily my favorite From Software game yet. But anyways guys, that's gonna do it for this review, so hopefully you found it to be helpful, and as always, I will see you in the next one.